Is there a difference between those two? Are they kind of, is it exactly the same cheese, just with a different label on, or is the ingredient different, and are there things that we need to know about?
Yeah, so the way that I think about it is this index tracking is actually just a set, it's a recipe, that's what it is. So people write down a recipe of what they're going to do, and that recipe is repeatable time and time again. And it gives you most of what a normal fund manager would do. Not everything, because of course a fund manager will have decisions over whether they buy or sell or overweight certain shares in their portfolio, whereas an index, as long as you stick to that set of rules, whether it's buy the top 40 or 50 largest companies on the JSE, and that is a repeatable way to get investment exposure. So that's how I think about it. So that it really doesn't matter, and a lot of people tie back the index to an ETF. So we've got this very strong link in the market between that. Everything index tracking is ETF only, and that's not actually true. Index tracking is really a way of investing money, and it has a lot of different flavors. The way you implement it could be in an ETF, or it could be in a unit trust, or many other ways of doing it. I think so you've got this feeling around that an ETF is automatically cheaper, and the way that people look at this is they look at the fund fact sheet, for example, of a unit trust, and they look at the fund fact sheet of an ETF, and they say, well, actually, you know what? Mostly an ETF is going to be much cheaper. I'm going to buy an ETF. I think what people are missing, though, is that there's a difference in the way that your money gets into the fund between a unit trust and an exchange-traded fund. So in a unit trust, we call them off-market. And what happens is that your money is invested directly inside that unit trust. And so it arrives inside the unit trust bank account as cash. And the fund manager has to go and then buy stocks inside that unit trust. And so all the fees and costs of that fund manager buying those stocks are captured in the unit trust. But an ETF is different. When you go to an ETF, you have to do it through the market. You either go through the primary or the secondary market, the stockbrokers. But you now have to pay a fee to get inside that unit trust. And that fee will consist typically of your stockbroking. There might be a straight cost, which is the cost of clearing, and a few other costs to get you inside. So if you want to compare the fees between a unit trust and an ETF, you have to take into account the fact that you're going to pay to enter a unit trust. And I think that's what a lot of people miss with regards to the difference between the two ways of getting index tracking into your portfolios.
So just to backtrack slightly, you're saying to get into the and you said unit trust, but you mean exchange traded fund in this context. So
yeah.
It's the buying. So it's the total buying cost of once you've bought the exchange traded fund. So it's the brokerage. There'll be some taxes. There'll be some fees that you pay to the stock exchange as well. It's not just what you pay to your stockbroker, and that's part of the cost. And then once you go into the investment, the exchange traded fund itself also has some costs. And what your comment is, you need to add up the internal costs of the exchange traded fund plus as the client, your buying costs, and then say, right, this is my fee now, bearing in mind that if you want to sell the investment one day, you're also going to have those exit costs. And so if you want to compare the apples with apples, it's saying, let me look at all of those fees as a package, and then let me compare that to the cost of buying an index tracking unit trust, for example, where those fees are there, they're clear and they're transparent. But then you make your comparison of apples with apples.
Yeah, and that's very hard to do. And I think you're absolutely right. Understanding the round trip cost, we call it a round trip cost of owning an ETF versus a unit trust that tracks the same index, it isn't simple. And it is very difficult to understand, but I think that's the main point to note, is that it's not necessarily true that an exchange traded fund is always cheaper than a unit trust because of these costs. There's even things when you enter an exchange traded fund that are not actually costs. They're not explicit fees against what you invest, but they do have to be taken into account. And so that makes it incredibly difficult to do. And our industry is not wonderful at being able to allow people to have that easy comparison between investing in an index tracking unit trust versus an index tracking ETF. And so unfortunately, it's not one of these wonderful answers where we can go and say, hey, here's a little secret tool, and if you do this, you know, you're going to get the answer. But I do think we do need to make people aware that, you know, the adage of thinking that an ETF is cheap is not necessarily true. I think people need to bear that in mind.